Hello, my name is Phillip MacDonald and I'm a Special Collections Librarian here at NC State University Libraries.
And my name is Taylor Wolford. I am also a Special Collections Librarian at NC State University Libraries. And today we are dying to be here. You may have noticed we are in a completely different space. We are in the Public Sciences Lab on campus. So thank you to the Public Sciences staff for allowing us to use your lab for the day. And what we're doing today, Phil, do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, we're going to do a couple different natural dyes with fabrics. We're going to do sumac, turmeric, and cinnamon.
Yeah.
And we're going to do some of the pre-process right now to get the fabric ready for dyeing. So the first thing we're going to do is prep the cotton and prep the fibers by scouring. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes. So the first step in dyeing, the technique we're doing today is called natural dyeing, meaning we're not using really harsh chemicals or synthetic dyes to dye our materials. So the first step in that is actually scouring the materials. So we're using cotton fabric today, and to scour it, that basically means you are cleaning the fabric to prepare it for the dyeing process so that the dye could absorb a little bit better when you get started.
Perfect.
Okay.
So we got the pot of water. You start with a pot of water, and then, is it, oh, it is on. Is it on? Yes.
It's on.
Perfect. Put it on high. Let me see.
I mean, I feel like at this point we just need to wait for the water to
Yeah, now we're just waiting for the water to boil, but we'll make sure to record everything, so.
Yes. So while we're waiting for the water to boil, we can talk a little bit about how this idea formed, how our idea formed to get this started. So Phil and I think we were doing either a textiles unboxing, or a bees unboxing with the libraries. And somebody had posted in our chat that they would be interested in us using some of the dyeing recipes that we were talking about in the unboxing. And so that's why we're here today.
Yeah.
What was your experience like trying to replicate these dyes at home?
Fun. I mean, it was super fun. I'm glad that I'm in a more lab setting, so we have a little bit more control on the environment. It was super hot in the kitchen and just like tons of steam everywhere. So hopefully this will be a little bit more straightforward and nicer. But yeah, and it was our first unboxing that it came from. It was the textiles, and then we used some of the materials that we talked about in the video were like these 19th century like textbooks, or some of them were workbooks from students in textiles here at State, and so some of them had like used natural dyes in order to dye the fabric. So yeah, so this is, how long has it been?
It's been at least a year.
At least a year. So this unboxing has been a year in the making, you could say.
Yeah, and another while we're waiting for this water to boil, it's taking its time.
It's not plugged in.
No.
So first thing you do with anything, make sure the hot plate's plugged in.
Yeah.
So now that we have that, we can move forward.
Yeah.
And we already measured out our washing soda, 35 grams, and so, but we wait till it's boiling to add it, and then wait for it to kind of bubble up, and then it's good to go.
Yeah. Something to note is that you can dye natural fabrics with natural dyes without doing sort of these preliminary steps. Some cultures, like in early Indian medicine, did not use these steps, but it does help the dye adhere a little bit better for the longevity of the fabric and the dye, so that's why we're doing it today. But primarily in early dyeing practices, they did not do all of these steps to prepare the fabric before dyeing.
I'll be honest, when I did this at home, I did not do these steps. So I'm interested to see how it's different, the same, if it's necessary. Probably, like you were saying, though, with longevity, like maybe in like a year or two, we would know like the difference between the scoured and unscoured fabric.
Over the long term.
Yeah. So the water's almost at a frolicking boil, and so we go ahead and add.
Yes, so we've pre-measured out 35 grams of washing soda, and this is going to clean the fabric before we dye it. So we have our water, half of the pot is filled with water, just water, and we're going to go ahead and put in the washing soda and give it a little mixy-mixy. Okay. Give the washing soda just a little bit of time to incorporate with the liquid. Another suggestion we have, full disclaimer, you should probably have gloves and a lid for your pot so that the chemicals don't bother your eyes too much. So after that, when the bubbles have sort of subsided and you've turned it back down to a simmer, you can go ahead and put in the fabric that you will be working with. So
how many strips do you want to put in?
We can just put in one.
One, that's what I thought.
Yeah. You might need more washing soda depending on how much fabric you're trying to dye, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like it's per weight fabric, so you can measure out about 10 to 20% of washing soda per however many grams of fabric you have.
The cloth, yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
And that's how we measured it. Obviously, we're working with a tiny, tiny strip.
Yes.
So you're going to stir the fabric every 15 minutes or so to make sure that it's adequately scoured or cleaned. And then finally, when it's done and it's been simmering for about an hour or two, you can take it out of the pot and wash it with cold water. And it'll be ready for the next step. So yeah, we can just come back. Let's
take a gander.
Yes, let's take a gander inside of the pot. It has been scouring for a couple minutes now. Really like less than a minute actually.
Less than a minute, but it's already like the water's already turning like brownish and gray, like it was dirty. And these are fresh Kirkland cotton tees, so I'm very surprised.
Well, I think what this demonstrates is the importance of cleaning your fabric prior to dyeing, because in the manufacturing process and shipping and transportation and all of that, the fabrics, especially natural fibers, pick up a lot of dust and dirt, and they just accumulate a lot of brown stuff, as you can see. So this is really important to get all of that out. And when you're done with the scouring process after about an hour or two, probably your water will be mostly brown at that point.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So after we have scoured, we're going to move on next to the mordant process.
So now we're going to do the mordant, and this is another fixative to help retain the color from the natural dyes. And so this is, we were using alum.
Yes,
right?
alum. Yes,
okay.
It's alum.
And this is from the grocery store. We were able to get this from the grocery store. Super not difficult to find. And so we cleaned the previous container. We're just using a new one. And so we're getting it up to heat, and then we're going to, do you think it's hot enough to go ahead and stir in?
Yeah, yeah. So we filled it up just a little bit, enough to submerge the cloth. And then we measured out a tablespoon of alum to put in, or alum, however you say it.
YouTube it, you'll find out.
And a fixative, or mordant as they call it, is really important because it helps the dye adhere to the recently scoured fabric better. You can, with any of our recipes today, skip the scouring and the mordant step, right? And still have a vibrant result. We tested out some fabrics without doing these steps, and they worked really great, which we will show later. But this does help the dye really stick to the fabric, and it's a great step in the process if you are interested in using natural dyes.
Perfect. And you can use this for berries, but if there are other like natural dyes, you can also use vinegar in this step, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you are using, if you're using like spices or
like a turmeric
or a cinnamon, you can use alum. You can also use salts. Now, if you're using berries or like onion skins or avocado pits, which you can also dye with, you can use vinegar as your mordant fixative. Chemical.
Wonderful.
Okay, it looks like it's starting to boil.
And you want it to dissolve completely, right?
Yes, you want it to dissolve completely before you put the mixture in, just so it distributes evenly around the cloth. It doesn't like fix onto certain points of it.
Cool.
So after your pot has reached a full boil, you can go ahead and put the fabric into the pot and give it a mix. And then next, we will move into the next part of the process, which is actually applying natural dyes to your prepared fabrics.
The real stuff.
Yes.
So we're going to do our first dye. And so we boiled 4 cups of water, and they're now at a royal. And then we're going to add about 1/4 cup of sumac. You want to stir it in?
I will go ahead and stir this.
And then you let it simmer for a little bit, and then you let it simmer for about an hour.
Yep, there we go. We're going to expedite the process
Yes.
a little bit. So typically you would leave this sumac in at a simmer. You can turn down your heat for about an hour, an hour and a half. And then you put in some vinegar, which Phil is going to put in next before we put in the fabric. And this also just helps the fabric, the dye adhere to the fabric a little better. And I can go ahead and give this a mix before we put
it concentrates the color, deepens it.
Okay, there you go.
And then you pop in the cloth.
Yep, and then you can go ahead sporadically while this is simmering, go ahead and mix it so the dye goes on more evenly. There is another way you can do this in which you bundle all of the spice into like a cheesecloth. And you put it in here at this point so that the spices don't sort of stick to the fabric. But you can also, when you're done with the dyeing process, wash it off with cool water and hang it to dry, and that'll remove all the spices as well. So sumac is native to Western North Carolina, which is really cool. Disclaimer, there is a poisonous strain of sumac, so do not use the white berries on the bushes that you can find in Western North Carolina. That's not the right sumac. But for our purposes, we just went to the store and bought a bag of sumac for like $2.99. It's pretty easily accessible at your grocery store, just like everything else we're using today, which is great. And then when you are done with your dye, you can keep all of the dyes that we've prepared today. This is what it's going to look like in the little containers there. This is sumac dye, and you'll see it's going to be a lot lighter than this depending on how strong you make it, but generally speaking, it'll be this sort of like pink reddish hue. And then, like we said, you go ahead and wash this with cold water, hang it to dry, and then Phil has an example of what it looks like when it is completely done.
It's a lovely salmon.
It is.
I would say.
Yeah, I really like it. It's a pale, pale pink. If you use sumac berries, which we had also talked about, if we could locate them, it would be more concentrated and it would be closer to like red.
Yeah.
But it is a really pretty like pale pink. I'm not sure if it's showing up on the camera, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's already, this is what, like 5 minutes? Less than 5 minutes, and it's already kind of working some of its magic.
Yeah, so this is about, it's been a couple minutes, like you said, and you can already see it starting to turn a little pink. You can also cool off this liquid and leave it in overnight for a longer dye. But as you can see, it turns this really pretty pink color, and that is what the sumac dye has done to our white fabric.
Yeah, it'd be perfect for like a summer vacation color. Yeah. So now we're going to do turmeric, which is for your yellows and lovely colors like that. And so now we got a pot of water boiling, and we're going to just like sprinkle the turmeric in.
This is about 2 tablespoons of turmeric. You can add more if you want a more vibrant color, and depending on how long you're going to let it steep for. But we don't really have that much fabric to dye for our test, so 2 tablespoons is about enough. You can go ahead and mix it. And you can honestly, turmeric is such a strong dye, as you can tell by the color of this wooden spoon, that you can just put the cloth right in and it should dye fairly quickly. Here we go. Yep, it's already starting. You can go ahead and mix it. You can see.
It's a lovely like mustard,
Yeah,
which I think could be a spring or fall color.
Yep, and see, it's already retained a pretty significant like mustard yellow, orangey color. It's really beautiful. This is again another thing, another dyeing recipe that's really important in ancient Indian medicine. Turmeric as a spice is believed to have like anti-inflammatory properties. So dyeing fabrics like this and then putting it on your body, in some practices believe that it can also help with inflammation or lethargy or anything that might be ailing you. So it's a really interesting thing to think about, is like dyes and how they can help you physiologically.
Yeah.
So that's one benefit to these sort of more natural dyes. And Phil has over there some of our pre-prepared dyes. So we replicated this process at home, and we did a t-shirt this time, and this is how vibrant it comes out when it's fully dried. So you'll take the cloth out and you'll wash it in cool water again, and then I would definitely recommend air drying this. I put it in my washer and then my dryer, and now both are stained yellow. Like the
Don't
spoon.
do that.
Don't do that. But you can air dry these. Definitely don't recommend air drying them in direct sunlight because that will bleach the color right out. It'll be completely light pale yellow to white again. As I told you, I put another one of those t-shirts out in direct sunlight and it is now white. So turmeric reacts very differently in sunlight, especially on a dye form. So that being said, we can move on to our next dye, which is cinnamon.
So now we're going on to cinnamon for reds and browns. So we have some boiling water, and I'm adding about a quarter of a cup of cinnamon.
And you're gonna wanna mix this. Cinnamon is a little bit hydroponic, meaning it does not fully soak into the water. So you're gonna wanna mix it pretty thoroughly in comparison to, I would say, some of the other spices we've used today.
And if you want to find out what that would do to you, just Google cinnamon challenge, and then you'll find out.
Yeah. So you're gonna let this simmer. How long would we recommend this
for? About an hour.
About an hour, yeah.
Similar to the sumac.
Yeah, let it simmer for about an hour. And again, this just kind of helps the spice absorb into the water so it can be more evenly distributed on the cloth. We're gonna go ahead and put the cloth in now and give it a little bit of time and see how much dye we can get on the fabric in a couple minutes.
This one definitely smells the best.
It does.
I do love the smell of turmeric, but the cinnamon just, especially for the fall.
Christmas.
Yeah, Christmas, holidays.
So now that the dye has been soaking a little bit in with the fabric, Phil's gonna mix it around a little bit just to make sure that it's getting all of the cloth saturated. We want to talk a little bit about the history of cinnamon. So cinnamon in ancient times was known to come from India and later from present-day Sri Lanka. It was one of the most sought-after spices in the ancient world. Cinnamon was like the equivalent of gold in ancient Egypt because it was so expensive and hard to obtain and transport from India to the rest of the world. So by the time it made its way to ancient Egypt, it was being used as a dye for fabrics. It was also being used for cosmetics, which is really cool. And lastly, it had been used for medicine and like medical properties. And it was also used for pottery because it could stain the different the materials that they used for their pottery.
Cool.
So cinnamon, as well as the turmeric and the sumac, have a lot of different applications in cultures across the world. And as you can see, it has already, after about 5 minutes or so, started to give the cloth a really nice, like tannish brown color with a little bit of red, I would say.
I know, yeah. It smells fantastic in here too.
It smells great.
I wish we could do smell-o-vision or something.
Yeah. So that is it today for our stream. Thank you for joining us today in the Public Sciences Lab in our nice space. Please join us next for a live panel discussion of the recipe book that we got a lot of these recipes from. We will bring that out, show it, and we will also have a live discussion about some of our failures and some of the things we learned dyeing at home and in the lab.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome. My name is Phillip MacDonald. I'm a Special Collections Librarian here at NC State University Libraries. I'm here with my colleague Taylor Wolford, who's also a Special Collections Librarian, and we have a special guest today for the other half of our unboxing dyeing. We have Dr. Renzo Shamey, who is the SIBA Professor in Color Science and Textile Chemistry. His research interests include color science and technology, computer applications in textile wet processing, and dye application in textile chemistry. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And we We were watching the video while this was going on, and we were already learning so much from Dr. Shamie. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we learned a lot about our successes and failures, which we will get into in a little bit. But first, we would like to bring out some of the materials from SCRC that were the inspiration for this stream. We have a really wonderful manuscript from the 19th century that is about 30 plus recipes for textile dyeing, and we premiered this in a previous textile stream that Phil and I had done. But it's a really fantastic look into the past in terms of what materials were used for dyeing, and as we demonstrated in our live stream, how long these chemicals and natural dyes have been used throughout history to produce really vibrant results. So some of the really interesting things that we pulled from is there is a recipe for red dye on cotton. And Phil is also going to share the digitized version of this in the chat. But this copy here is pretty much what we used for the dyeing process. It has sumac in it. And I can read a little bit of the text as well for those of you who are listening. It says, 100 pounds of cloth equals 2.5 pails of sumac. So sometimes the measurements were a little precise in this book. Sometimes they're just like a dash or a sprinkle. For our purposes, we had to do a little outside research to understand exactly what a pail meant or what our equivalent would be today. But all of these materials are available for research in the Special Collections Reading Room if anyone is interested. It has also some really interesting indigo recipes in here that we can chat about later, because we did try to do indigo dyeing at home and in the lab, and it was a massive failure. So I'd love to talk to you about that later. Okay. And then another book that we have is a really interesting text by Francis Mustard. It's called Easy Dyeing, Upwards of 50 Recipes for Making Color from Plants. And we were actually chatting about this book a little bit before because it has some really interesting natural materials that you can use to make dyes, including the beetles, right?
Cochineal.
Yes. Can you explain the process of that a little bit?
Sure. So these are female species of a specific type of beetle that live on cacti. And the process involves collecting a large quantity of these beetles, grinding them down into powder form, and then processing them further to produce small quantity of red dye.
Wow. So how large of an operation can that be? Is it something that can be done mass production-wise, or is it a smaller quantity?
There are some places where this is done on a mass scale. I am aware of at least 2 locations, one in Chile, one in South America, another location, I don't remember the exact location, but I do know that there are farms where this is being produced because cochineal is used in food and in beverages and stuff like that, because apparently it has less of a kind of reputation for being harmful.
Oh, interesting.
So despite the fact that you require a large quantity of land, a really big piece of land and a lot of cacti and, really quite a lot of people to process the beetles to produce small dye. It's still quite popular, apparently.
Yeah, and this book is also available for research. A really cool part of it is that in the end part of it where the index is, there are samples of what it would look like, for example, if indigo were dyed, or beetles, or onion. So a lot of this was an inspiration for Phil and I when we were working in the lab and coming up with the concept for this stream. But I'm also really excited to discuss with you today the science behind what we did.
Sure.
And what we did wrong.
Yeah.
So Phil, you want to go ahead with our first question for the day?
Sure. So kind of like, and we've talked about this a little bit while the video was going, but can you talk a little bit about the difference in synthetic and natural dyes, specifically now with like the environmental reasoning for doing synthetic dyes?
So before the invent of synthetic dyeing, of course, all dyes were produced in the way that you're describing in your books. So either plant-based, root-based, or animal-based, right? So majority of these required large quantities of animals or plant. And of course, in many cases, for the demands that we have today, industrial demands, this would be incredibly difficult to achieve. So dyes that were collected from plants, for example, had to be extracted, and that's not a straightforward process. It requires some other chemicals that people don't really talk about. And let's say indigo. For indigo, you have woad as one of the natural plants that you can use, or indigo ferris, which is one of the sources of this kind of material. The amount of land required to process indigo just for the denim industry would be more than all the farmland that we are using for food and stuff.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not going to be very efficient. So synthetic dyes, of course, go a long way in meeting the demands of the industry, not just for coloration of textiles, but also for plastics, for food and beverages, and some other applications as well. In digital industries, you're also using colorants for storage of energy. Now, you use all of the solar cells have colorants that essentially absorb energy from light and convert it to the form that we can use in our devices, right?
Right, wow.
So these are based on synthetic dyes. Synthetic dyes are also used for curing cancer. A specific type of synthetic dyes can be injected into tumorous cells, and by activating them, we can release oxygen species that attack the cancerous tumorous cells, right? So all the stuff that we hear about dyes and synthetic dyes and natural dyes, we need to start and kind of look at it holistically. What is a natural dye? Where does it come from? How much land or other resources is going to be required to produce a small quantity of it? Is it still naturally available, or should we kind of start from scratch? And if we are starting from scratch, what's the actual process that's going to make it feasible, right? And then once you've produced a colorant, how much of this colorant is needed for how much of the material that is going to be requiring it? So I have my questions and worries about natural dyes, because a lot of journalists have also sometimes contact me and they say, well, we want your spiel on natural versus synthetic dye, And this is what I tell them. Natural dyes are good in a small scope, right, for crafts, for industries that don't really require large quantities. Synthetics are the way to go if we can make them better. I'm not saying synthetics are the answer to everything, but because they have problems, and we can talk about those problems.
Yes.
But they definitely are more efficient.
So, referring to my notes, the first synthetic dye was created in 1856. It was produced on accident by a chemist in the lab, and it was mauve, so it was like a reddish hue. Looking back at that history now and where we are today, what is the technology that's being developed or being discussed in the field about creating potentially synthetic dyes that are also sustainable?
I love that question.
Yes.
Because I talk about this person, William Henry Perkin, in my classes a lot. He was an 18-year-old kid who was working under another chemist, and they were trying to produce quinine, which is a type of drug, for malaria treatment.
Right.
And by accident, of course, they produced mauve or mauvine, right? And this is a purplish color. It happens to be a cationic dye, which carries a positive charge. And it was used for the coloration of wool and silk.
Right.
And until that point, purple was a very difficult color to reproduce, right? So Tyrian purple, right? We talk about historically important dyes, and purple is up there, like amongst the most important, because its production was so difficult and it was so expensive to produce that, Romans actually made it a crime to wear purple.
Wow.
Right? So you were only allowed to wear purple if you were authorized to wear it.
Sure.
And the dyers, on the other hand, had to dwell outside of the city walls, because in order to produce it, they used shells and urine from horses and stuff. So the dye houses stank, So it was very difficult to be a dyer.
Sure.
Right? So I joke that we live to die and die to live, right? And those people were really, really in the, heat of the moment, I kind of say this. It was incredibly difficult to just make a living as a dyer.
Mm-hmm.
But now, of course, with the advent of synthetic processing, we started with mauve or mauvine, and that was the start of a revolution in chemistry. Really, it kind of created organic chemistry. And all of the pharmaceuticals, everything that we now do with dyes or dye-related chemistries really was based on that discovery. That
An
little
accident.
discovery. An accident.
Wow.
It's almost, yeah.
It's almost always the case.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A failure or an accident.
Well,
exactly.
speaking of failures, Phil,
Yeah,
do
so-
you want to move into some of our failures in this dyeing process?
So why don't you pull our indigo, I say in
Yes.
quotes, and can we talk a little bit about why it didn't adhere or why it's green instead of...
So this was a test for us
A
in the lab,
pre-video
like
test.
a pre-lab test in which we tried to replicate early indigo dyeing techniques with the vat and all of these chemical reactions, and we were not educated on how to do this, to be quite honest with you. So we were going for indigo and got this really interesting green color, actually.
Beautiful green.
But we don't know exactly where we went wrong, if
Okay.
you want to talk about that.
Sure. So indigo is, what's the color that you're expecting to get?
Like a dark blue, like a deep
bluish
blue.
color,
Yeah.
And that would be the actual color of the properly processed indigo.
Yes.
So indigo as a colorant is insoluble.
Yes.
So the first step is to make it soluble.
Got it.
And that requires the use of a so-called reducing agent and an alkali. So the alkali would be your baking soda or something like that, and the reducing agent could be something like sugar. Sugar is a good reducing agent, right?
That's a lot simpler than I thought it was.
Right. I gave you sugar, but in actual processes, we don't use
Yeah,
sugar.
of
right?
course.
So,
Okay.
so together, they convert the insoluble colorant to something that is soluble. And once the colorant is soluble, it can be picked up by the textile material, right? Once it is inside the textile material, it needs to go back to its original insoluble form, because otherwise you'll just simply wash it off. The
Right.
dye that has gone in will just go out, right? So that process is the reverse of reduction, which is oxidation. Now, oxidation can be done with air. So I suspect if you air this T-shirt long enough, and just hang it outside or just air it, it'll turn to blue.
Amazing.
We'll have to post about it, like, once I have you do that, yeah.
I'm gonna
It's
test
good to
that
know,
out.
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's also to point out, we were on a bit of a time constraint, and indigo from start to finish to process takes a while,
Yeah.
correct?
Yes,
Like
yeah.
several hours to a couple of days to
Right.
deepen the hue.
But it wasn't like we tested all the stuff the day before we were going to videotape it or
No,
anything
no,
like
no,
that.
no.
yeah.
We weren't.
We were,
that.
yeah, we were prepared.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's just a complicated process, and doing it in your kitchen probably also not the best idea.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we stayed away from the indigo process for our work.
Yeah, but layering, what you just talked about, is adding one layer of colorant on top of another layer and then another layer, so you can make your denims as deep blue as you like or as light blue as you like, and that's a process that we do in our industrial application of colorants to denim a lot.
Right.
So the yarn goes through a trough that contains the colorant, comes out, it's skied, and then it goes back in, and it gets another layer of colorant, it's skied again. So this is repeated until you attain the right color, the right shade.
Wow. Another, I wouldn't say this is a complete failure.
It's a beautiful salmon. I think it worked.
Phil likes the salmon color, but this was our sumac sample. You might not be able to tell on the screen. It's a very, very, very light pink. It looked a lot darker on our video, obviously. We were like submerging
Literally just
it.
taking it out.
Yeah, and taking it out. But
dye.
what would be the reason? I mean, should we have used berries? Was that the problem in terms of color vibrancy and longevity of the dye?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure, because if you use the berries, the colorant may come out of the fresh berry a little bit easier, probably. I think part of the difficulty might have been preparing the colorant again so that it is absorbed properly and then it's maintained in location. Because the dyeing process is not just applying the dye. You have to make sure that there is an interaction between the textile and the colorant. If that interaction is not there, the colorant is going to fail, either by washing it or by exposing it to light or something else.
Right.
So sumac, you mentioned in your introductory video, it was a bit difficult to dissolve, right? So it's a difficult colorant to dissolve. So if you don't dissolve it properly, it won't go in. There simply isn't enough colorant to go inside the textile material. And the time that you provided for the coloration wasn't sufficiently enough either. So you have to allow the textile to open up. The pores in the fiber open up if you heat the textile material, and different fibers require different temperatures, right? But you allow it to be open for a long enough period, and then the colorant seeps in. That process is industrially called exhaustion. The colorant is exhausted into the textile material. Once it is exhausted, it is inside the textile material, then you can fix it in location so that it will stay there. And with indigo, like we talked about the reduction process and getting the colorant in, with some dyes you don't need this. All you need is a little bit of salt, for example, with direct dyes. With some other colorants you require other chemicals. So with sumac, I think the main problem might have been that the dye was not really properly dissolved, so it didn't really get inside the textile material.
That's fair. So what you're saying is dyeing, textile dyeing takes time and focus.
It does.
Which
And processes.
I, at least, had neither of. So that's good to know.
And patience.
Yes. I also don't have any of that. So that's good to know. For those of you who are replicating any of these recipes at home, take your time. Make a day out of it,
Right.
Like, have a cup of tea and just make some lovely fabrics. That's really interesting. Now, another spice we dyed with was turmeric, which is is it a fugitive dye? Is that the correct term?
Yeah.
Okay, that was another success, right? But also a little bit of a failure. So here is the turmeric t-shirt that we dyed with. We had enough turmeric that we were able to dye like 2 t-shirts and a couple slips of the fabric.
Beautiful yellow.
Yeah, it is. It is a beautiful. Phil, how did you describe it in the video? You said like a lovely fall color.
I think, something like that.
A lovely shade for fall. And it's really vibrant. I don't think it's faded at all since we did it. Do you think?
No, I don't think so. It has been in a plastic bag since then, so there hasn't really been much time to breathe.
But this is another example of us learning as we go with this process, which I'm realizing is also a lot of how science works. But I put our first batch of t-shirts in the washer, and then with detergent, and then in the dryer, and both are completely stained now, and that pretty much took almost all of the color out of that fabric. Natural dyes, it's recommended you air dry primarily, right, or wash separately. And then the other batch of t-shirts we made, I left out to dry in the sun, direct sunlight, for like 3 days, and those were almost completely white by the time I retrieved them. So can you explain a little bit of turmeric as a dye and what was happening there?
Sure. So I think the problem that you're describing is a common problem in the coloration of textiles. Daylight any type of light source is a source of energy. And these molecules that we call colorants, they impart color to textile material, but the molecule itself should last in the original form. Otherwise, if it breaks down into smaller components, it will lose its ability to impart color, right? I should say something here before we talk about the dyeing process. It may be a bit controversial, but the question is color a physical thing? Is the colorant a physical colorant that, you know, is existing outside of the way you're looking at it, or is it a construct of your imagination?
I mean,
Wow.
I don't think I'm not ready to talk about metaphysics right now.
No, I haven't.
But I know it. But that's a really good point. That it is all just us perceiving it, and
Right.
and it is just energy going into our
Right.
irises
Yeah.
and our cones.
So there is no molecule as so-called colored molecule.
Huh.
Some molecules are able to be excited by light, and the excitation generates a type of sensation that we perceive as color.
Yeah.
And Newton said, you know, a long time back, you know, that for light is not color, to speak properly, but it actually stirs a sensation of this or that color in our minds, right? And now I digress. But color, if it's in the form of a colorant that is applied to a chemical material like a textile fiber, if it is going to retain its original shape, then it is going to retain its color or the sensation that it generates. If it breaks down, it won't be. So curcumin or similar types of compounds, you know, that are present in, for example, turmeric, these break down as a result of, you know, receiving sunlight. And the breakdown compound is no longer capable of generating color. So one of the things that we can do to protect the colorant is sheath it. So one way of doing that is to do so-called encapsulation.
Oh.
You start with a colorant, you form a bubble around it. That's a protective bubble. And that protective bubble doesn't allow light to get through, or it doesn't allow water to wash it off. So when we talk about color fading, it is either fading because light breaks down, or it is washed off, or other chemical constituents that may be present, for example, from your sweat, or some other chemicals like chlorine from the, you know, pool or something like that. They can break down colorants into smaller components. So what you did was simply apply the colorant and then put it outside, and light simply got to it and broke it down. Now, if you apply a mordant, like you said, you know, like with alum, you know, you can have potassium alum or ammonium alum, different types of alums. These can also prolong the life of the colorant because they can scavenge some of the energy from light, or they can increase the strength of the interactive bond between the colorant and the textile material. And if there is a interactive bond, it is much harder to break it down. That is essentially what's happening here.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I was just sad when I went outside and it was completely white after a full day of dyeing, but that makes a lot of sense. I just think it's funny also that they call it a fugitive dye, as if it's going to like run away with the color.
It does,
Well,
yeah.
Which it kind of did.
It kind of did.
It kind of did,
Yes,
yeah.
This is kind of like not off topic, but like a different question. Like, do you do anything in like your daily life with like clothes that like to help protect colors? Because now I'm feeling like every time I wash something, I have to be relatively careful of not like losing the colors and stuff like that. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, so synthetic dyes, like we talked about, these are tested prior to their application.
Gotcha.
So most of these colorants have to have a minimum level of durability before they're considered commercially important, right? So majority of the colorants that are used on commercially available material that we buy have already been tested, depending on how much, of course, you pay for it.
Yeah.
Right? So stuff like indigo for example, as a natural colorant, they have really good durability to color because the chemical structure is very resistant to breaking down. Some of the other colorants are not as resistant, so you have to either apply a fixative, and these fixatives combine their structure with the structure of the colorant, make a complex, and that complex is harder to break down, or they make it bigger, and that bigger compound cannot be easily washed off. So there are different approaches. But generally speaking, once you've bought something, there is very little you can do about it.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
That's kind of, okay. Can you talk a little bit about why some fabrics are difficult to dye or easier than others?
Sure. Yeah, so the coloration process really requires two players, right? You have the colorant, and then you have the substrate. If the substrate is hydrophobic, right, which doesn't like water, water is used as the medium to carry the colorant, right? If the colorant cannot be absorbed, it's not going to go there, right?
Okay,
So fibers like polypropylene or polyethylene, these are industrial fibers. These are very hydrophobic.
Okay.
They don't like water, right? So we have to apply the colorant to these fibers during the formation of the fiber. So once the fiber is formed in a polymeric form, and as it is melting down, we are adding colorants to it, right? So the colorant is embedded inside the fiber. It cannot ever come off, right?
Okay.
It's there,
Yeah.
right? And it's an industrial form of coloration. We call it mass pigmentation. But then there are fibers that are hydrophilic. They like water, like cotton, like wool, like silk, right? Now, wool and cotton actually have a hydrophobic layer on their outside. Wool has keratin-based structures, and they don't allow water to go in. But there is a gap between these shells, essentially, and water can seep through there. In the case of cotton, we have natural wax. And the scouring process that you were talking about, it removes some of that wax.
Oh, okay.
Got it.
Right? And it removes some of the impurities so that the fiber becomes more open, more accessible, easier to dye, right? So with some fibers, dyeing is an easier process because the fiber is more receptive to start with. Some fibers are much harder to select, for the coloration process because they don't like water. But we can do other things. Then the other thing that you have to consider is the interaction between the colorant and the textile material. You don't want the dye just to go in, because if it goes in easily, it comes out easily.
Okay.
You want the fiber to attach itself, or the dye to attach itself to the textile material. So sometimes there are interactive forces between the dye and the fiber. And these interactive forces, the stronger they are, the more difficult it will be to remove the colorant, right? So there is a class of dyes known as reactive dyes. And these chemically react with the textile fiber. So it becomes impossible almost to break them down. Then some other dyes, like natural colorants that you're just talking about in the case of adding a direct dye to a textile fiber, we just need a little bit of salt because the interaction between the dye and the fiber is based on electrostatic forces. So something is positively charged, something is negatively charged, they attract each other, okay? And there are dyes that are positively charged, like sumac, for example, is positively charged, right? And if you apply it to a negatively charged fiber, then the interaction will be pretty strong, right? And you can make some fibers to carry charge. And most of the fibers, when we place them in water, they also become negatively charged because water is a better conductor, right? So electrons run away, right? And the material kind of receives these electrons on its surface, so it becomes negatively charged. So you add a little bit of salt, and the salt neutralizes the surface of the textile material.
Oh, I had no idea what any of that was for.
Right.
Now, because we talked about salt for a little bit, and then by the end, when we start dyeing, we're like, we'll see how it goes.
Well, how does vinegar operate if you use vinegar?
That is for pH control.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Because again, some fibers require to be charged. Like wool and silk can carry a positive charge in an acidic environment. So you add a little bit of vinegar, they become positively charged. And now the positively charged fiber can easily attract the negatively charged dye.
Right. That is so interesting. We were just following steps, and to hear what's actually going on is really fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, we're just throwing things in a pot.
Maybe we'll do a blog post of like post this interview, like tips and seeing how much better we were able to do it, knowing knowing some of the science behind it.
All right, yeah, sounds good.
I think I'd really like to get back to the question of sustainability in textile dyeing too, because I think it's a really interesting concept. Because on one hand, you have proponents of natural dyes saying that it's non-toxic, that it's biodegradable, that it's a better alternative for environmental pollution, and then, as we've discussed, there are also drawbacks to that. So what do you see as the future for synthetic or natural dyes in the field? Like, what are they moving towards with developing dyes?
Yeah. What I did not mention about synthetic dyes is that there were examples of synthetic dyes that were actually harmful to humans.
Sure.
Right.
There were dyes that were carcinogenic, some dyes that are toxic, not just carcinogenic. So unfortunately, we don't know this until we test the colorant, right? So you have to produce a colorant, then usually we test them and we figure out if they're going to cause either allergies or some problems for health, and this is an issue that needs to be addressed. So there is a whole host of colorants that are no longer used. Some mordants are no longer used because these are heavy metals. And heavy metals are not good, in terms of their disposal to the environment, right? So some chromic dyes, we call them chromics because they used chromium. And they produce really good, beautiful black colors or heavy shades. But of course, chromium-6 kills fish, right?
Okay.
Oh, no.
So you release it into the rivers and the fish float on the surface rather than inside the
Oh,
water,
no.
right? And not good news.
No, yeah.
No.
Not good news. And then environmentalists, of course, see the color that is disposed to the rivers, and you see the red river flowing, or so these are all problems.
Yeah.
And they need to be addressed. Now, one needs to remember that the human eye is capable of detecting 1 part per million in terms of concentration of colorant in water. So that is 1 milligram in 1,000 liters.
Sure.
That is a small amount of dye. So to try and reduce the sensitivity of course, our perception to detecting color is an important consideration. I'm not saying colored rivers are good, obviously not. But you will be able to detect a small quantity of color in water, even if you treat the discharge water very well. So there are processes that are required to test the effectiveness of the colorant in terms of its usage, how it's going to affect the environment. These all need to be done and properly kind of carried out to increase the perception of the population in terms of their usage, in terms of their environmental kind of applications, etc. And then there are other processes. There are people who are looking at so-called structural color. And when we talk about structural color, we are talking about really light interacting with objects in the form of bending and as a result kind of creating sensations of color when there is no colorant present.
Right.
And these last forever, right? Because there is no colorant present there. It's simply light, changing its path as it's moving from one layer to the other.
That's incredible.
So you can produce hollow shell fibers or fibers that are made of 2 different components or 3 different components. And by adjusting the thickness and the type of material that's used, you can actually form color without actually color being there in the first place.
Magic.
So that would be magical, right? But the problem is, of course, reproducing color is an important part of our industrial color application. You know, so if I'm interested in this yellow and I want to reproduce this exact same yellow, I need to know the colorants and the recipes and all of that stuff, or come up with a predictive model that generates something similar. With structural color, this is incredibly difficult.
Okay.
Right? So it's not easy to do.
Right,
that
to
type of
replicate
thing.
an exact shade
Right.
of a color. Okay.
Right.
Because there's thousands, right? There's thousands variations.
Yes, and people are very picky
Yeah.
about their colors, right?
That's true.
So we want to make sure that, you know, what we are producing meets the demands of the market,
Sure.
but at the same time is safe.
Yeah.
Right? Safety is really, really important. So toxicity testing, environmental kind of friendliness in terms of the types of ingredients that are used to produce the colorant. And
Right.
these are usually, synthetic colorants are usually made from petrochemical kind of material, right? So there's a finite quantity of these around.
Yeah.
So we have to start and think about what's going to be next, right? So people are looking at other sources as intermediate kind of material for the production of colorants.
That's amazing.
Amazing.
That's really awesome. So I think, did you have any other questions?
No,
for me?
I think, and then we're landing perfectly at time, so this was wonderful.
Yeah, this was a lovely discussion.
Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
So much, Dr.
Oh, it's
Chamey, for
my
coming.
pleasure.
This was amazing, and we learned so much. And like even while the video was going, we were like amazed at all the things we're learning. So again, thank you so much for
It's
coming
my
and talking
absolute
with me.
pleasure. Thank you
I
for
think
having
you've
me.
sparked some young chemists over here in the libraries. So you might see us in the lab one day, just ready.
Yeah, maybe we'll do.
Excellent,
Maybe we'll
yeah.
do a follow-up post with like maybe trying it again, but with actual science.
With real science.
With real science, with real guidance.
Yeah, you can come over to the College of Textiles, by the way. We have good labs for the coloration of material, right?
That's
One of
amazing.
the-
We'll keep that in mind.
That's a dream.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you so much, everyone.
pleasure.
And I think that's it for today.
Yeah, thank you so much
Thanks
for
for
coming.
joining.
And see you later.